Do you remember the COVID lockdown, the isolation, the fear, wondering what the future had in store for you, spending time with only the people in your home, wondering when you would get to see your friends again? Do you remember where you were when it all happened? I remember where I was. Lance was on hospice and he passed away about 5 months after the initial lockdown. Everyone was still isolating then. And I had family and friends come in from out of town and they stayed with me for about 3 weeks. And then they left and I was completely alone. About 6 weeks seems to be the average time for people to stop checking on someone who's lost a loved one anyway. But I had been isolated for so many years already. We'd been isolated for about a dozen years. And this isolation was like nothing I had ever experienced before. I was completely alone, and my husband had just passed away. I had friends checking on me, but because everyone was still living in fear or anger about COVID, it was very difficult. So I didn't see people very often. For months, I couldn't go to bed until about 5 o'clock in the morning because I had to be completely exhausted so that I could fall right to sleep. Otherwise, I would just start crying and I couldn't stop. And I'd wake up with a massive headache and then I would feel awful. So I got to the point where I was staying up until about 5 o'clock every morning. I had a girlfriend in England who Zoomed with me once a week at midnight, my time, just to check on me, to make sure that everything was okay. I tried an online grief group, but it was mostly elderly people and I just didn't fit. So I was scrolling through Netflix one day and I found a show called Afterlife with Ricky Gervais. And I started watching it and it was just what I needed. So I grieved with Ricky Gervais. It was a show that I connected with at a time when I was so isolated and I just needed to know that there was somebody who understood what I was going through. And every time I watched that show, I thought, whoever wrote this, I think it was Ricky Gervais who wrote it, but whoever wrote it understood what I was going through. And it just gave me that connection that I needed at that time. I couldn't handle being in that house. Lance got sick within a few months of moving in there, and our 15 years living there was all about him being sick. Every time I opened my eyes, every time I turned a corner, there was something about illness in that house. So I decided about 2 months after Lance passed away that I was going to sell and I was going to move across the country. I figured I would move in about a year and a half. I thought that's about how long it would take me to get through everything because I had a lot of stuff. Lance had all of his medical gear that I needed to get rid of, everything that he owned, all of the things that I knew I didn't want to take with me when I moved. But because everybody was isolating and I couldn't go anywhere, I decided to start packing. And within 6 months, my house was ready to put on the market. And 9 months after he passed away, I was living halfway across the country. I spent 6 months living by myself on a farm out in the middle of nowhere. I just needed some solitude. And I mean, everybody was isolating anyway. So it kind of made sense that I would be out there in the middle of nowhere by myself. I felt like I had suffered a traumatic brain injury after he died. I couldn't read. I could read, but I couldn't comprehend more than a couple of sentences for probably about 9 or 10 months after he passed away. I also couldn't drive. I had PTSD from all of my years driving him back and forth to the hospital, all of the emergency visits. And suddenly, even being in my car, I felt trapped. I couldn't carry on a conversation beyond the basics. How are you? What have you been doing? I couldn't think of anything to say because my whole world for the past dozen years had been about Lance being sick. I didn't know what to talk about. I had nothing to talk about except for grief and loss. About 10 months after he passed away, I was able to start reading again, but driving was still hard and conversations were still hard. And then there was the fog. I was sleep deprived for over a decade while I was caring for Lance, and I lived in a fog then. And I thought that that was bad, but that was nothing compared to the fog of grief. I don't even know that I can fully explain it, so I'm not going to try to right now. Just know that the fog that I lived in, just it made everything so heavy. It made everything so unclear, and it was just really hard to deal with. It was really hard to function. The fog is different for everyone. It is something that most people who are grieving talk about, but mine lasted for about 3 years. And one problem that I had with my driving was my exhaustion. I had been sleep deprived for so many years while caring for Lance, and the exhaustion would just hit me and felt like I had slammed into a brick wall and I needed to sleep right now. And that happened one time when I was out driving. I was practicing driving. I was only a mile away from my house, and I got to the end of the dirt road and I hit that brick wall and knew I needed to go home, but I couldn't because suddenly that 1 mile felt like 100 miles and I couldn't even make myself drive that. I had to get out of my car and walk around the car for 10 minutes before I could even get back in the car to drive home because I was that exhausted. So that made driving scary too, because I never knew when it was going to hit. When Lance died, I hadn't had a day off in 7 years. That was 24/7 care. If you add up just the weekend days in 7 years, it adds up to 2 full years. So I told everybody when Lance died, I was going to take 2 full years off to do nothing. And that's what I did. I had to learn how to rest. I slept a lot. There were times when I would stay in bed for 2 weeks and only get up to get food and drink and go right back to bed. I was just so exhausted. I had to learn how to take care of myself, and resting was definitely one of those things. I met some wonderful people here. They helped ease me back into driving and getting back out into the world. I was intentional with my time. I journaled a lot, and I used my journal entries to look back on, to learn about what I was going through and how far I had come. I had to figure out who I was, because for 25 years, my life had been dictated by a disease that I didn't have. And I had given up so much of myself. I couldn't even remember the basics of the foods that I liked or the things that I liked to do. I didn't know what kind of music I liked. I had to stop and ask myself every time I did anything, is this something that I like? Was this something that was Lance's? I bought a home and I moved into it 15 months after Lance passed away. My first 2 years in my new home, I was still only able to drive a few miles by myself. So I only left my house about once every week or two, and I only ran necessary errands. Medical and dental visits caused a lot of anxiety because that seemed to be all our life was about when I cared for Lance. But I knew that those were necessary things, so I made myself do it. I basically immersed myself in everything that I did, facing my fears, just so that I could move forward, because there were so many fears. I felt debilitated often by them.
It's interesting listening to you talk through this whole timeline of when not just the isolation from the lockdown, but just the process afterward of moving forward or not moving forward, going through grief, going through loss, all of the things that you just talked about. I mean, I was kind of a bystander, just observing, walking through this process. And I don't have any frame of reference for that because I've never been through that type of a situation. And I hadn't really been close with anyone who had gone through that grief process. Your situation didn't feel like watching, say, my grandparents go through grief when they lost their spouse. It felt different, probably because they were in a different season of life than you were. And they had had, 40 or 50 very good years together, maybe 60 years, I think, maybe in my grandparents' situation. And those were good years. Those were healthy years, full of memories, so they could reminisce toward the end and walk through that process together to an extent. And yours was a long string of loss from the beginning, from his first diagnosis all the way through to his death. It was a series of losses in your relationship. So this was the culmination of a lifetime full of loss rather than a lifetime full of abundance that was now over, something coming to a close. So it felt different watching you go through it. And I had very little idea how to support you or how to encourage you in that time. So I felt, although I was trying to be supportive and reach out, I felt mostly like an observer, realizing this was just something you had to go through. It was something you had to figure out, and I couldn't figure it out for you, and no one else could figure it out for you. And that you really had very few resources and very few people that could relate to what you were going through, because it's just not, it's not a normal life. While everyone has a unique circumstance and situation, most people experience a very similar life progression. Yours was an outlier. So I always felt like you were kind of left to navigate it all on your own. And if I can say, I think you did a pretty amazing job.
Thank you. I did feel like that I was left to navigate it on my own. I mean, I do have a lot of friends, and I did have a lot of friends checking on me, but like I said, it was during COVID and people were still afraid. And so I didn't get to see people very often. And I was completely alone in that house where Lance had gotten sick, where he had grown sicker over the years, and where he died. And it was really hard. So I've heard from so many people, and I read it too before he passed away. It's not a good idea to make big decisions like moving during that first year after losing someone. But I knew that I couldn't stay there. I knew if I stayed in that house, I had a 100% chance of dying. Talked about it before. I was journeying towards death with him. And being in that house just made me feel like I wasn't going to survive if I stayed there. So I had to leave. And looking back, I can see why they say don't do anything big like that in the first year. It's because there's the fog, there's the grief, there's the stress, just that added stress of a move. Moving is stressful anyway, but it was compounded by all of the other things that I was going through. But I still knew that I had a better chance of survival if I left and was able to move somewhere that I'd never been before. And I knew that I could heal easier if I did that. And I've healed a lot. I've been here for over 3 years, and I'm so glad that I moved here.
I remember you telling me that you were moving. I can remember the first time you told me that you were going to move. And for me, I was thrilled. Like, it, when you told me, it hit me in a way that I was like, that's exactly right. That's exactly what she should be doing right now. I don't know why. I suppose if I had, I feel like a rational, logical reaction to that as a good friend would have been, hey, maybe you should think about this a little longer. But it sounded exactly right. And, I was just talking with someone yesterday about the role that intuition plays in our life. And for me, I think that's what takes over. If you can develop your intuition, which you had to when you were taking care of Lance, because you were so busy, you had to rely on that to tell you when things were off or things weren't right or things were okay. You had to become very in tune with that part of you. And I would say most people are not. I would say most people have no idea what their sixth sense or their intuition is saying to them. And you're very in tune with that. So that probably guided you while you were in that fog. Like you needed that.
Yeah.
That
I feel
was what
like
gave you the right direction.
when I looked back on my move about a year after I got here, I couldn't believe all the things that I had gone through to get here and how much work it was, and that I made it here. I followed my instincts. I just knew that this was what I needed to do, and I just did it. And that's kind of how I live my life. So it worked for me.
Were you nervous to tell people that you were moving or to even bring that up? Or did you not tell many people?
Oh, I told everybody I was moving. I wouldn't say that I was nervous. I felt like everybody was living in their own world because of COVID still. And it kind of felt like I'm not even going to say kind of, it felt like I was on my own. I needed to do what I needed to do because everyone else was doing what they needed to do for themselves. And I needed to do this for me. So I knew that I was going to miss my friends because I do have a lot of friends there. But I didn't know how long it was going to be before I could see them. And I couldn't live in that house any longer. I needed to go. I needed to get out of there. And I'm so glad I did.
One of the things that you talked about was not being able to have conversations because your life had been caring for Lance. And that's what you had to talk about. Do you remember the first thing that changed in your life that opened up like a new stream of conversation with strangers or new friends? Do you remember like kind of what that first step was?
I don't remember the first step really. I just remember I met some amazing people after I moved here, and they all just were so great about easing me into whatever it was. I have a couple of girlfriends that would go shopping regularly, and they would invite me to go with them. After I got more comfortable driving, they would allow me to drive. I don't know how scary that was for them. Mm, I wasn't doing very well driving. But I would just listen to them more than anything. And I think that that was a really important part for me, was listening to normal conversations and paying attention to things that people were talking about that were normal, that were not about medical stuff. And that was probably, I would say that was probably the first step for me, was just listening to the conversations.
Wow, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Re Yeah. Wow, that's cool. Um, did they know that you were learning from their conversations? Did you ever say, "Oh, I'm just listening and learning how to have normal conversations again," or were you just kind of observing?
I think that this was just such a gift when I moved here, that the right people were placed in my life. And I think they just knew. I never said anything to them about that specifically, but they knew what I'd gone through. They knew where I was at. In fact, one of them was my neighbor right outside of the gate where I lived. I was living out in the middle of nowhere, and I was there for 3 months before I even went down and introduced myself to them because I just wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to talk to anyone yet. I wasn't ready to tell anyone my story. And so I waited until after the 1 year anniversary of losing Lance. And then I called and asked if I could go down there and meet them. And I sat and visited with them. And from then, they just were a part of my life. And I think that they, my friends that I met during that first year here were people who also have good instincts, and they just knew what I needed. I mean, they took me into stores to go shopping and into restaurants, and I hadn't been inside stores shopping for clothes. I hadn't been going into stores grocery shopping very much. I hadn't been inside restaurants for a while. So all of these things were just little baby steps to get me where I needed to be and to be around people, being around them, but also being around other people and all the activity that was going on. It was really overwhelming for me at times, but that was really a big part of my healing journey. And I'm so thankful for them.
That's so cool. It just kind of reinforces to me the idea that the most important thing we can do for the people around us is to be authentic and genuine. If we're constantly trying to manipulate a situation so that it affects someone else a certain way, whether good or bad, right? Because manipulation can have a positive intention. You can try to manipulate where you go and why the conversations you have to help make this new friend feel comfortable because you know she just lost her husband. So we'll try and go here and talk about this and not say that and do all these things so that she feels comfortable. Where if they had done that, you wouldn't have had the opportunities to relearn how to just be in a normal social situation. They just had you come along for the ride, right? They just invited you into their lives so that you could see, okay, I remember this. This is how you go into a restaurant. This is how you have a conversation. This is how you order food. This is how you look for, your waiter in a restaurant, like things that I would just take for granted. They just invited you along so that you could learn they were authentic.
Yep. Oh, I just got all emotional remembering that because I felt like a brand new, like a child having to relearn all of these things. And it was so hard, but they were so amazing.
It just reinforces that to me, how wildly important it is to be authentic. And you and I have talked about this before, that if we're being real and we're aiming toward the good in life, the right people are going to come along. The people that are supposed to be in our path are going to be in our path. And if we're listening to that intuition, that inner voice, we're going to know, we're going to figure it out. We're going to be like, yep, this person's supposed to be here. And when those paths intertwine, it ends up being so good.
Yep. And it was so good. It's still so good. I'm so grateful for all the people that have come into my life since I moved here and the people that have stayed in my life.
When you were explaining this entire journey, the other thing that really struck me is just you figuring out who you were. So relearning how to live in the world and then trying to figure out, well, who am I? Because that's a big part of socialization, really, is sharing about yourself and learning about others. And that's how we kind of navigate the world. And so if you didn't know who you were, then it's kind of hard to share about you when you're walking through a store and somebody says, "Oh my gosh, this is so cute. Do you like this?" And you say, "I don't know." I don't know if I do. Let me think about that for a minute, which isn't what we're used to with adults because everybody's got a pretty good handle. Well, many people have a good handle on who they are. I wouldn't say everybody, but how was that process of kind of sifting through what you knew about yourself and determining this was me, this was Lance, and then determining this is me that's valuable to take forward into the future. This is me that needs to be left here in the past. And the little bits of Lance, because after that many years, some of those things that were him became you, and some of the things that were you became him. And he wasn't there anymore. So I think that normally happens in a marriage anyway. But when one person leaves, you're still left with that kind of integrated personality. But I'm sure there were things that you wanted to carry on of him and things that you wanted to leave behind. So how was that process? What things did you do to kind of help sort all that out?
Well, I'm still doing that. But that's where journaling came in for me. I journaled so much. I'm still journaling a lot, not as much as I was in the beginning, but that's really how I've gotten to know who I am and the pieces of myself that I want to carry forward, the pieces of myself that I need to work on or that I want to leave behind. And I think I'm still figuring out because Lance and I were together for 27 years. He's been gone 4 years now. I'm still figuring out those integrated parts because, like you said, that happens. And I think that there was so much of us that was integrated because he was sick for so long. I have said before, I didn't know where one of us ended and the other began. I had to really stop and ask myself, is this me or was this Lance? I mean, there were some things that I definitely knew that I didn't like. He had a lot of dietary restrictions the last decade of his life. And that was really hard for both of us because we both love food. And I wouldn't have food in the house that I liked that he couldn't have because I didn't think that that was fair. And if I went out to eat, which was maybe only once or twice a year with a friend, I would get something that I knew he couldn't have, and I wouldn't tell him about it because I didn't want him to feel bad. But if I did take him out to eat, I would still get something that I knew he could eat. So that's one thing. But then he'd been on restrictions for so many years, I couldn't really remember what I liked. So I've had to relearn what kind of food I like. Music was a big thing for me. Music took me a long time because that was a big part of both of our lives. And because of his dementia, we listened to a lot of 80s hair bands and a lot of 70s music and a lot of old country. And I got really tired of it. I didn't like the old country, like the 60s and 70s country. I wasn't a fan of it. That's the kind of country that he liked. So it took me a long time to figure out what kind of music I liked again.
I remember coming to see you and you sharing with me all your new music. And it was so fun to watch you because you were just so excited that you had found these new things. And I remember you sharing with me all your playlists for different days of the week. And I just thought that was so cool that you sought that out and found a new way to relate to music. Like that was so cool to see that part of your brain activated and actively seeking out new material to kind of absorb and like I said, interact with. That was fun.
Yeah, listening to music was a a big deal, and we can talk about that a little bit more next time. But I think that's enough for this time. I just wanted to share some of my journey because I know as I've talked to people who have gone through the grieving process, it's different for everyone, but we do have similarities in the things that we go through. And sometimes it's hard to find people who can relate to what you're going through. And it's just another one of those things that I wanted to share so that people know that they are not alone in what they're going through. So thanks for joining me, Jenna, and I will see you next time.
All right. Thanks for having me. We'll see you. Bye.